Before I start this story, I just want you to know that it's for educational purposes, and I mean no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this case. My intention is to present the information objectively and respectfully, aiming to foster understanding and knowledge. John George Haigh was born in Stamford, Lincolnshire, and grew up in the village of Outwood, West Yorkshire. His parents, Alfred and Emily, were members of the Plymouth Brethren, an extremely conservative and anti-modern Protestant sect who advocated very austere lifestyles. He was confined to living within a 10 feet, 3 meters, fence that his father put up around their garden to lock out the outside world. Haigh would later claim he suffered from recurring religious nightmares in his childhood. Despite these limitations, Haigh developed great proficiency in the piano, which he learned at home. Haigh won a scholarship to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, Wakefield. Claims were made that a desk carved with his name remained at the school, and caretakers would run trips to the cellars to show it to first-year pupils, but they were put aside when a teacher of 30 years at the school said the desk was removed over 20 years before. He then won another scholarship to Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy. After school, he was apprenticed to a firm of motor engineers. After a year he left that job, and took jobs in insurance and advertising. At age 21, he was fired after being suspected of stealing from a cash box. On the 6th of July 1934, Haigh married 23-year-old Beatrice Betty Harmer. The marriage soon disintegrated. The same year that Haigh was jailed for fraud, Betty gave birth to a baby girl while he was in prison, and she placed the baby for adoption and left Haigh. Haigh's family ostracized him from then onwards. Haigh moved to London in 1936, and became chauffeur to William McSwan, a wealthy owner of amusement arcades. He also maintained McSwan's amusement machines. Thereafter he pretended to be a solicitor named William Cato Adamson with offices in Chancery Lane, London, Guildford, Surrey, and Hastings, Sussex. He sold fraudulent stock shares, purportedly from the estates of his deceased clients, at below-market rates. His scam was uncovered by someone who noticed he had misspelled Guildford as Guildford on his letterhead. Haigh received a 4-year prison sentence for fraud. He was released just after the start of the Second World War. He continued as a fraudster, and was sentenced to several further terms of imprisonment. Regretting that he had left victims alive to accuse him, he became intrigued by French murderer Georges Alexandre Sarratt, who had disposed of bodies using sulfuric acid. Haigh experimented with field mice and found that it took only 30 minutes for the body to dissolve. Haigh was freed from prison in 1943, and became an accountant with an engineering firm. At a public house in Kensington, Haigh chanced upon former employer Mac McSwan again. Mac was happy to see him and took Haigh to see his parents. During the friendly reunion, they told Haigh of their recent investments in property. This information was to seal their fates. After socializing with Mac for several weeks, Haigh carried out his plan on the 9th of September 1944. In Haigh's diary, he claimed that he had a sudden need for blood, so he hit McSwan over the head with a blunt instrument. Then he slit his throat. He says, "I got a mug and took some blood from his neck in the mug and drank it." Haigh later found a 40-gallon barrel in which to put McSwan's body, and then filled it with sulfuric acid. He described in his confession how, when the body was finally submerged in liquid acid, the fumes overwhelmed him and he had to go outside. Later he covered the drum and went home to sleep, leaving his former employer and friend to dissolve into a liquid sludge. It was during the night that he supposedly suffered from more surreal and blood-filled nightmares. The next day the remains of McSwan were little more than cold liquid and lumps, which Haigh disposed of down a drain. Knowing that he had killed someone and removed all traces of them gave Haigh a feeling of euphoria. Haigh managed to convince McSwan's parents that their son had gone away to avoid conscription. He even sent fake postcards to them from Scotland pretending to be their son. However, Haig's main concern was to acquire the rest of the McSwan assets. The next murder would be committed with the addition of new equipment to deal with dissolving bodies. A stirrup pump, DIY tin face masks, and even a bath tub made of steel, painted to make it more resistant to corrosion, were all employed by Haigh in his obscene workshop of death. They became curious as to why their son had not returned, as the war was coming to an end. On the 2nd of July 1945, he lured them to Gloucester Road by telling them their son was back from Scotland for a surprise visit. There he killed them with blows to the head and disposed of them. After informing the McSwans' landlady that the couple had gone to America, Haigh had all of their mail forwarded to him, including Mr. McSwan's pension. He then set about forging their son's signature on a power of attorney form. By forging a deed on a property owned by Mrs. McSwan and appropriating it into a false name, Haigh managed to make nearly £2,000 from selling the property. That, along with securities and sales of possessions, totaled £6,000. For a while Haigh managed to swindle people through a variety of scams, including posing as a liaison officer dealing with patents, and setting up fake branches in several towns. It was also around this time that he later claimed in a police confession that he had killed and disposed of a young man called Max from Kensington. Haigh's spoils from the McSwans were running out fast, and the evil sociopath needed money from new victims. This time he chose a more worldly couple, Dr. Archibald Henderson, 52, and his wife, Rose, 41, who were selling their home. Cultivating a relationship with the couple, based on a shared passion for music, Haigh encouraged them to reveal information about their properties. Renting a storehouse on Leopold Road in Crawley, London, Haigh moved his possessions from Gloucester Street, and began setting up his obscene workshop once again. This time, he ordered 3 carboys of sulfuric acid, and 2 40-gallon drums without tops. On the 12th of February 1946, he drove Dr. Henderson to Crawley and shot him in the head with Crawley's own revolver. He then left the body in a storeroom and set off to get Mrs. Henderson. After some reluctance, she was driven to the storehouse. Haigh shot her from behind and after trussing up both her and her husband's bodies, left them overnight. Haigh later claimed to the police that he drank blood from both of them. Haigh dissolved both bodies in acid, but this time the grisly act did not erase all traces, as Mr. Henderson's foot was left intact. This did not seem to bother Haigh too much, as he dumped all the remains including the foot in the corner of a yard. The psychopath by now felt immune to being captured. Efforts to maintain the impression that the Hendersons were still alive were methodical and time-consuming. Haigh even forged letters by Rose Henderson, writing a lengthy letter to her brother. After selling their properties and possessions, he acquired around £8,000 in total. Showing a sickening contempt for his victims, he even gave his girlfriend Barbara some of Mrs. Henderson's clothes to wear. Unexpectedly, Rose Henderson's brother Berlin was prepared to go to the police. Haigh managed to convince him that the couple had emigrated to South Africa on the grounds that Dr. Henderson had carried out an illegal abortion. As an indication of Haigh's depravity and sociopathic tendencies, he even planned on visiting the mother of a recently deceased school friend, whom he had spotted in the obituaries section of a local newspaper. No doubt Haigh had intentions to dispose of the grieving mother and misappropriate any possessions he could. His plan was foiled when the frail woman unexpectedly died herself. Haigh's money once again started to run out, mainly due to gambling and expensive tastes, which included staying at an upmarket hotel. While there he had socialized with a wealthy elderly woman, Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon, and thought up murderous plans to dispose of her. Haigh's next and last victim was Olive Durand Deacon, 69, the wealthy widow of solicitor John Durand Deacon, and a fellow resident at the Onslow Court Hotel. Haigh by then was calling himself an engineer, and he heard Olive talk to her friends about her idea for artificial fingernails. He invited her down to the Leopold Road workshop on the 18th of February 1949, and, once inside, he shot her in the back of the neck with the .38 caliber Webley revolver that he had stolen from Archibald Henderson, stripped her of her valuables, including a Persian lamb coat, and put her into the acid bath. 2 days later, Duran Deacon's friend Constance Lane reported her missing. Detectives soon discovered Haig's record of theft and fraud and searched the workshop. Police found Haig's attaché case containing a dry cleaner's receipt for Olive Duran Deacon's coat, and also papers referring to the Hendersons and McSwans. The workshop in Sussex rented by Haigh did not contain a floor drain, unlike the workshop he had rented at Gloucester Road in London. He, therefore, disposed of the remains by pouring out the container on a rubble pile at the back of the property. Investigation of the area by pathologist Keith Simpson revealed 28 pounds, or 13 kilograms, of human body fat, part of a human foot, human gallstones, and part of a denture, which was later identified by Olive Duran Deacon's dentist during the trial. Haigh asked the detective during questioning, "Tell me, frankly, what are the chances of anybody being released from Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital?" The inspector said that he could not discuss that sort of thing, so Haigh replied, "Well, if I told you the truth, you would not believe me. It sounds too fantastic to believe." Haigh then confessed that he had killed Duran Deacon, the McSwans, and the Hendersons, as well as 3 other people, a young man called Max, a girl from Eastbourne, and a woman from Hammersmith. These claims could not be substantiated. Beside his parents, the one person who was profoundly affected by news of Haigh being a callous mass murderer was Barbara Stevens, the woman he was supposed to love and marry. She visited him regularly in prison, trying to understand what kind of man she had been involved with. Did he intend to kill her, she asked. He never entertained the idea, was the seemingly genuine reply. However, Barbara knew that at some point she may have succumbed to a similar fate, when Haigh saw her as an inconvenience. There appeared to be no remorse on Haigh's part, and he reveled in revealing his grisly escapades, which were recounted in the newspapers. Even although the acid had destroyed a great deal of evidence, not everything had been eliminated. Ghoulish relics such small bones, dentures, Mr. Henderson's foot and a gallbladder were all discovered, as the forensic team sifted through tons of mud and sludge. Technicians had to wear rubber gloves and cover their arms in Vaseline to protect themselves from the acid. They found the following items: 28 pounds of human body fat, 3 facet gallstones, part of a left foot, not quite eroded, 18 fragments of human bone, upper and lower dentures, intact, the handle of a red plastic bag, a lipstick container. Despite the forensic evidence, it was Haigh's very own sense of invincibility and arrogance that was to be his greatest undoing in finding him guilty. Haigh was of the opinion that nothing could be found from his human slaughterhouse, and confidently recounted in great detail his escapades of death. As far as he was concerned, it was a case of corpus delicti. No bodies, no crime, no punishment. On the 1st of April 1949, E.G. Roby opened the case for the prosecution, before 10 Sussex magistrates. Haigh was in a confident mood and even made light banter throughout the proceedings, as if he was unaware of the magnitude of his crimes. If ever there was an illustration of sociopathic tendencies, that is the inability to empathize and recognize human feelings and emotions, Haigh was the perfect embodiment of such dysfunction. Haigh had, during an early confession, not only admitted to many of the deaths, but had also inquired as to what the outcome would be with anyone who was declared insane. It seemed at this stage Haigh had been mulling over the possibility of appearing mad in order to escape the noose, and had most likely invented the stories of nightmarish dreams, and claims to be a vampire, in order to literally save his neck. During court proceedings, E.G. Roby called 33 witnesses to prove premeditation of murder for gain. He laid out his case in the form of a basic chronology that showed how rational Haigh's movements were and had not been the actions of someone with diminished responsibility. Haigh was also examined by several doctors and psychologists who were interested in the defendant's claims to have a need to drink blood. Such a compulsion, if genuine, is part of a sexual deviation and related to the act of violence itself. However, Haigh, who it appeared had little interest in sex, gave no indication that he suffered from such a disorder. Most of the psychologists agreed that although Haigh suffered from mental health issues, he was not insane, and had been perfectly aware of his murderous actions that had involved meticulous planning. One eminent psychiatrist believed without any doubt that Haigh had a paranoid constitution, the same mental disease as Hitler. Haigh, they believed, had most likely developed a paranoid personality to escape his parents' suffocating universe, in order to relieve himself from emotional pain. His upbringing had contributed to a mental state where the dividing lines between reality and fantasy had become blurred. The result was that Haigh had an acute sense of omnipotence and believed he was above the law. He was in effect an egocentric paranoiac who, although aware that killing people was against the law, still thought that it was part of fulfilling his destiny. Haigh tried to impress on the psychiatrists more details of his abnormal dreams and obsession with blood drinking, but none of them bought his efforts to portray himself as a lunatic. However, something of which they were not aware was that Haigh had years before developed a friendship with an employee of Sussex Psychiatric Hospital, and had shown a great deal interest in mental illness. He possessed a talent for deception, having over the years also posed as a lawyer, engineer and a doctor. On the 18th of July, 1949, 4,000 people crowded into the small town of Lewes hoping to get a seat in the court. Mr. Justice Humphreys presided. Haigh had no money to pay for his defense, so the News of the World newspaper did a deal with him and offered to pay for his counsel if he would provide them with an exclusive. The Daily Mirror newspaper was also found in contempt of court for emphasizing Haigh being a vampire. The editor, Sylvester Bolam, was sentenced to 3 months in prison. The paper also had to pay £10,000 in court costs. Haigh pleaded not guilty. The prosecution rested its case of deliberate premeditated murder for gain. Haigh's defense counsel tried to rely on the issue of the defendant's insanity, describing for the court how his mental illness would have affected his ability to appreciate the morality of his acts. It was clear that Haigh was aware that what he was doing was wrong in the eyes of the law, as evidenced by his attempt to cover up his crimes. With that admission, the defense collapsed. There was only one issue to be decided, the question of the prisoner's sanity. The defense's psychiatrist failed to prove that Haigh's judgment was impaired. Also, because Haigh had initially inquired about getting released from Broadmoor, it appeared as if he was thinking of using insanity to get him off the hook. The prosecution declared he was simply a man who believed he had discovered the perfect crime, committed murder for gain, and then pretended he was insane when he was caught. The jury were left to decide whether paranoia could be considered a mental disease or defect. It took them only 15 minutes to come to a conclusion. Haigh was found guilty. The judge asked Haigh if he had anything to say for himself. Haigh cocked his head and said, "Nothing at all." Donning a black cap, the judge sentenced him to be hung until dead. Haigh finished his life story for the newspaper that had paid for his trial. He also wrote letters to Barbara Stevens and to his parents. He hoped to be reunited with them in heaven. His elderly parents did not make the journey to see him before he died, but his mother sent greetings through a reporter. Haigh mentioned that he believed in reincarnation and told Barbara that since his mission was not yet finished, he would be back. He insisted that he was not afraid to be hanged. Madame Tussaud requested a fitting for a death mask, which Haigh was more than happy to provide. On August 6, 1949, at Wandsworth Prison, John George Haigh, the murderer who dissolved his victims in acid, was executed. He bequeathed his clothing to Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors, where a wax figure of him was erected. He sent instructions that it must always be kept in perfect condition, the trousers creased, the hair parted, his shirt cuffs showing. Among other murderers cast in wax, Haigh received his place in history. This is all I have for this case. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. Your support means a lot and helps us create more content for you. See you in the next video.